Well, hello everyone, and welcome to the 45th Annual Midwest Philosophy Colloquium on the philosophy of conspiracy theory. Tonight it's my great pleasure to introduce David Coady, who is Senior Lecturer in Philosophy and Gender Studies in the School of Humanities at the University of Tasmania. Coady's research covers a wide variety of philosophical topics. Most of his current work is on applied philosophy, especially applied epistemology. He has published on rumor, conspiracy theory, the blogosphere, expertise, and democratic theory. He's also published on the metaphysics of causation, the philosophy of law, climate change, cricket ethics, police ethics, and the ethics of horror films. He's the author of What to Believe Now, Applying Epistemology to Contemporary Issues, the co-author of The Climate Change Debate, an epistemic and ethical inquiry, and the editor of Conspiracy Theories, the Philosophical Debate, as well as the co-editor of a companion to Applied Philosophy. So welcome, David, and the plan will be for David to give a public lecture, after which we will have a series of responses from our distinguished panel, and then we'll open the floor to questions from attendees. So David, you can take it away.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mark, and thanks everyone for turning up. It's been great. So I just want to share my screen and put some slides up here. Can everyone see the slide there?
Looks good.
Yep, looks
Okay,
good.
Okay. So although I will be discussing several definitions of the term conspiracy theory in this paper, I will not be offering a definition of my own. That's because I don't believe there is such a thing as a correct or even a good definition of this term, or incidentally of related terms such as conspiracy theorist, conspiracism, conspiracist ideation, and so on, which is why the title of the talk is why I'm not talking about conspiracy theories. I'm going to be talking instead about the term conspiracy theories and related terms. I hold that we should stop using as opposed to mentioning these terms altogether. They appear to do no good while doing considerable harm. In the not too distant past, we got by without them, and we can and should learn to do so again. Ever since the term conspiracy theory was first popularized, I'm going to say by Karl Popper, there's some controversy about exactly this. And I'm going to say in the 1950s, again, there's some controversy about this, which I think that's when it's really started to take off anyway. And ever since then, they've had a bad reputation. To call a theory a conspiracy theory is to imply that it's false, and also to imply that the people who believe it or who would like to investigate it, i.e. conspiracy theorists, are irrational. Conspiracy theories are widely held to be not only false and the products of irrationality, but also to be particularly harmful. Hence, they're widely thought of as a problem. And it's a problem which might be solved or at least mitigated through the intervention of social scientists, psychologists, and even philosophers. The problem is typically thought of as being of quite recent origin, or at any rate, one which has recently been getting worse, especially in the age of COVID-19, when conspiracy theories are routinely spoken of as a threat to public safety or even to democracy itself. Now, I think all of this is a mistake, and to quote Gilbert Ryle on the myth of the ghost in the machine, it's not merely an assemblage of particular mistakes, it is one big mistake. Conspiracy theories are not a new or growing problem. In fact, conspiracy theories as such are not a problem at all. Contrary to conventional wisdom, we do not have a problem with conspiracy theories. We do, however, have a problem with the term conspiracy theory, along with a bunch of related terms that it has given rise to. And this problem really is quite new and increasingly widespread. The emergence and spread of a set of terms has been conflated with the emergence and spread of a phenomena to which these terms putatively refer. As a society, we have made a use-mention error. The spread of pieces of language has wrongly been taken for the spread of things corresponding to them in the world. In this paper, I'll be concentrating on the psychological literature on conspiracy theories because I regard it as particularly pernicious. If, as I've argued, and will continue to argue, the term conspiracy theory plays the role in our secular society that the term heresy once played in medieval Europe, that of stigmatizing beliefs that contradict the teachings of the most powerful institutions of the day, then psychology plays the role of the Inquisition, that of defining and enforcing orthodoxy. This is a very troubling situation, especially since the beliefs that attract the pejorative label conspiracy theory tend to be marginalized political beliefs. There's a disturbing history of psychologists pathologizing marginalized political views. We're not yet in a situation where we're forcibly institutionalizing people whose political beliefs are deemed unacceptable by the state or other powerful institutions in psychiatric hospitals, as happened in the Soviet Union. But we have got to the point that a group of prominent psychologists have written to a leading French newspaper, Le Monde, calling on the government to, and I quote, more effectively fight the disease of conspiracy theories. The authors of this letter do not say what they mean by conspiracy theories, nor do they define related terms such as conspiracy thinking or conspiracism, which they use in the letter. It's simply assumed that we all know what these terms refer to and that things they refer to are very bad things indeed. One of the most striking things about much of the conspiracy theory literature, and especially the literature from within psychology, is that authors routinely assume they are all talking about the same things when closer examination reveals that they are not. I hope to make it clear that when Michael J. Wood claims in an article in Political Psychology, which is a journal which has published an awful lot of material I'll be discussing, that, quote, since the mid-1990s, a growing psychological research tradition has generated a great deal of knowledge about the antecedents and consequence of belief in conspiracy theories, he is mistaken. Equivocations over the use of these terms has merely created an illusion of progress. Okay, so let's look at some of the definitions to be found in the psychology literature. Most of the definitions in the psychology literature and elsewhere are neutral. It's worth noting most of the literature I've surveyed on this doesn't actually include definitions of the term, but here are four, I think, representative examples of definitions. And they are neutral in the sense that they don't explicitly say what is supposed to be objectionable about conspiracy theories. They don't say, for example, that they are false or that belief in them is irrational or harmful or whatever. So here are some representative examples, 1, 2, 3, and 4. Can I just assume everyone can see that, right? I won't read them out, just take a little while to survey them. And the references, by the way, I've got a list of references I can give you so you can look them up towards the end of this. Now, these definitions, as you'll note, vary in some significant ways, and they clearly pick out quite different phenomena. For example, definition 1 requires the conspiracies in question to be both malevolent and illegal, whereas definition 2 merely requires them to be perceived as one or the other. So the word perception and the move, you'll notice, from conjunction to disjunction there means it's talking about quite a different thing. 3 and 4, on the other hand, make no reference to illegality at all, perceived or otherwise, and 4 makes no reference at all to malevolence or any other moral property. It's clearly far and away the broadest of those definitions. The differences between these authors, if they're to be taken at their word, mean they're talking about different things. However, the differences shouldn't be allowed to obscure something that they all have in common. On each of these definitions, some, indeed many, conspiracy theories are true and well known to be true. Precisely how many are true will depend on which definition we adopt and perhaps how we understand the word malevolent, which occurs in 3 of the 4 and in most of the others as well. Nonetheless, it's perfectly clear that there are and always have been groups of people who do join forces secretly, and that many of them are reasonably understood to be malevolent. Although many conspiracy theories on each of these definitions are true, the examples of conspiracy theories cited in all of these articles and in the psychology literature in general are clearly believed to be false by the authors. What's more, they clearly expect their readers to agree. One example mentioned in all 4 articles, and is almost always mentioned in literature on conspiracy theories, especially the stuff in psychology, is the theory according to which there was a conspiracy behind John F. Kennedy's death. And it's worth some consideration. Now, in my view, reasonable opinion is divided over whether that theory is true. One thing, however, is clear. The fact that it is, according to these definitions and every other definition I'm aware of, well, sorry, actually I'll come to exceptions later, a conspiracy theory is no reason at all for thinking that it is not true, or for thinking that those who believe it do so as a result of some irrational or non-rational process. Many conspiracy theories on these definitions are not only true, but well known to be true. It may or may not be the case that there was a conspiracy behind JFK's assassination, but it is certainly true that there were conspiracies behind the assassinations of Julius Caesar, of Abraham Lincoln, of Tsar Alexander II, of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, of Anwar Sadat, and I've got a list of literally dozens of others, but I'm not going to keep going through them. Charles Pigden has reviewed high-profile assassinations in the late 16th and early 17th century Europe and found that about half of them were the products of conspiracy. There seems to be no reason to think that conspiracies in general and conspiratorial assassinations in particular are less common now than they were then. Now, does this matter? Couldn't these psychologists say that they are not concerned with normative issues concerning whether particular conspiracy theories are true or rationally believed? Rather, they're concerned with empirical questions about the causes and effects of belief in them. As Wood, who I mentioned before, says, they are trying to find, quote, the antecedents and consequence of beliefs in conspiracy theories. He doesn't specify whether they're true or false or held on rational grounds or not. In fact, this attitude seems to be quite widespread amongst psychologists. The authors of the Le Monde letter I mentioned earlier explicitly say that they, quote, so I can go back to that because I've got the quote there, we focus on the psychology and sociology of conspiracy theories conceived as the outcome of situational factors, personality and cognitive traits, largely unrelated to the truth or falsity of said conspiracies. Notice the scare quotes around conspiracies as if conspiracies are mythical entities. The idea that we can address substantive psychological or, for that matter, sociological questions about the causes of any category of belief in a way that is unrelated to, largely or otherwise, the truth or falsity of the beliefs in question is deeply misguided. If you want to explain the belief I have that I am a father, the first thing you have to do is find out whether I am in fact a father. No attempt to explain my belief that doesn't first settle the issue of whether the belief is true is going to be credible. This is because, putting aside extremely rare or far-fetched cases of the kind philosophers love to consider when analysing knowledge, when a person's beliefs are true, that fact is central to any adequate explanation of why he or she holds them. The point may be made clearer if we consider a different category of theory, one which doesn't have the bad reputation which conspiracy theories, in my view, unjustly suffer from. So I'll choose scientific theories, which are generally held in a degree of respect, indeed reverence, which conspiracy theories are not. Suppose psychologists decided to investigate why people believe scientific theories, without regard to whether the theories in question are true. The proposal would, of course, be treated by serious scholars as a piece of relativistic confusion. There may, though in fact I doubt it, be some interesting generalizations made about why people believe false scientific theories, but there can be no prospect at all of a general, truth-independent and informative account of why they believe scientific theories. For the same reason, there can be no prospect of a general, truth-independent and informative account of why people believe conspiracy theories. The explicit claim of some psychologists that they are offering such an account is disingenuous, to put it mildly. They are inevitably, implicitly assuming that when they talk about conspiracy theories, they are talking about a category of false and irrational belief, and it's clear from their work that they are, in fact, doing so. So, perhaps noting this confusion, a small number of psychologists have recently tried to alter the definitions of conspiracy theories they use to make them objectionable by definitional fiat. Here are two examples. I've actually stuck in a third by Neil Levy, which is, I won't talk about directly, but the first two here, Brotherton French and Brotherton French and Pickering. you'll notice the former define it as unverified and relatively implausible allegation of conspiracy. And on the second one, it's a conspiracist belief, which it's clear from the context they simply mean that as a synonym for conspiracy theory, is the unnecessary assumption of conspiracy when other explanations are more probable. Okay. These definitions are, of course, quite different from the neutral ones we've considered so far. Although, as we saw, many conspiracy theories understood in accordance with any of the neutral definitions are true, very few conspiracy theories, or many fewer conspiracy theories understood in accordance with these loaded definitions are true. However, this has nothing at all to do with conspiracies or theories about them, and everything to do with the trivial fact that very few implausible or improbable, or to use Levy's term, unwarranted theories of any kind are true. Now, these definitions are extremely unnatural and misleading, to put it mildly. First, unlike any other category of theory, scientific theory, number theory, film theory, and so on, conspiracy theories on this understanding are supposed to be implausible or improbable or unwarranted by definition. Second, these definitions don't accord with their authors' actual practice, since these articles cite findings about conspiracy theories from other psychologists who are using neutral definitions of the kind we've already considered, as if they are all talking about the same thing. The most fundamental problem with these definitions, however, putting those things aside, is that they reduce the objectionable feature of conspiracy theories to a trivial matter of definition. Of course, we shouldn't believe conspiracy theories so understood, but this is just an instance of the general fact and a virtually tautological fact that we shouldn't believe any theories that are implausible or unlikely to be true or unwarranted. There seems to be no reason to believe that the fact that some people, and almost certainly all people, believe conspiracy theories that are implausible, unwarranted, or unlikely to be true is something that stands in need of explanation. It is a familiar fact about human beings that each of us believe things that are implausible and unlikely to be true. And if you take a broad enough subject matter, such as science, history, or conspiracy, on which everyone has opinions, we probably all believe things on that topic that are implausible, unlikely to be true. It's likely that we've all been guilty of assuming conspiracy when other explanations are more probable, to focus on the second of those quotes. But that doesn't mean that we were even temporarily suffering from the vice of conspiracism or conspiracist ideation, as Brotherton, French, and Pickering call it. After all, we've probably all been guilty of assuming non-conspiratorial explanations when conspiratorial explanations are more likely as well. Anyway, just come to an objection here, but it will be objected. Putting all these semantic issues aside, surely there really is a problem with conspiratorial ideation or conspiracism, understood as a disposition to be overly credulous towards conspiracy theories, and there really is an issue about how this problem can be explained and addressed. So you'll notice this has been the case in a lot of the literature. There's been a shift to, as it were, sneering at conspiracy theories to sneering at conspiratorial ideation or conspiracism, and occasionally you'll find people referring to this in something like these terms. It's a kind of epistemic or intellectual vice in which one is overly credulous towards conspiracy theories. So perhaps if we put aside my snarky comments, we can all, psychologists, social scientists, and philosophers, make progress towards addressing that problem. In fact, I've come to think that there is no such problem. Certainly the psychological literature fails to establish that such a problem exists. Still less does it make any progress towards solving this putative problem. I've discussed this matter at greater length elsewhere. Here I will confine myself to pointing out a few of the problems with it before arguing that there is good reason to think that these problems cannot be fixed. Okay, to start with, some of the examples psychologists have offered as evidence of conspiracism or conspiracist ideation are definitely true. Belief in a conspiracy by American government agencies to bring drugs into American inner city communities continues to be routinely cited by authors in this literature, as evidence of conspiracist ideation or conspiracism, despite the fact that it is true and has been well established as true for almost a decade now. Since it is true, it can hardly be used as evidence of excessive willingness to believe in conspiracies. If anything, the example demonstrates the opposite fault in those conducting the experiments here, psychologists, namely excessive reluctance to believe in conspiracies. Other beliefs regularly cited within the literature as evidence of conspiracism or conspiracist ideation, such as the belief that there were conspiracies behind the assassinations of John F. Kennedy or Martin Luther King, are highly controversial. Reasonable and well-informed people appear to disagree about whether there really were conspiracies in these cases. Hence, they're not the kind of things that can be cited as evidence of conspiracist ideation, that is, a tendency to be overly credulous of conspiracy theories. At least they can't be cited without providing some kind of evidence that there were no conspiracies in these cases. And of course, the psychologists don't provide that evidence, and you might think such evidence would be out of place in a psychological textbook, a point I will come to shortly. Of course, some of the examples of purported conspiracy cited in this literature definitely did not take place. Indeed, some of them are such that there is a legitimate question about how large numbers of people could come to believe that they did take place. However, it doesn't follow, and it doesn't in fact seem to be true, that people believe in these conspiracies because they suffer from conspiracism or conspiratorial ideation. Easily the most widely cited example in the recent psychological literature of this alleged vice is the belief that American government agencies were behind the 9/11 attacks. It's treated as a paradigm of conspiracism in virtually all of that literature. So here's just some of the examples. I'll give you full references to these later on, of recent psychological work that treats 9/11 attack, so the view that American government agencies, typically the CIA, were behind the 9/11 attacks as evidence of conspiracism or conspiracist ideation, virtually all of them as far as I can tell. Now, this is certainly a false belief. American government agencies were not behind the 9/11 attacks. And furthermore, it appears to be evidence of some sort of irrationality, though not, of course, necessarily the same sort of irrationality in everyone who has that belief. However, this belief obviously can't be explicable in terms of conspiratorial ideation or conspiracism, because it doesn't involve belief in conspiracy in favour of a non-conspiratorial explanation of events. Rather, it involves belief in one conspiracy rather than another, in this case, real conspiracy, namely the one that took place amongst the 19 hijackers, Al-Qaeda, and arguably others. Charles Pigden has pointed out the absurdity of trying to explain 9/11 without supposing there to have been some sort of conspiracy in the following passage, which I think puts the matter quite well. Nobody halfway sane supposes that the events of 9/11 were not due to some conspiracy or other. To think that, you would have to suppose the perpetrators assembled in the planes quite by chance, that on a sudden, by coincidence, it struck them as a neat idea to hijack the planes and ram them into the Twin Towers, the White House and the Pentagon, with the aid of other perpetrators who presumably they'd never met before. Okay, so obviously there was a conspiracy in this case. Those who believe American government agencies were behind that conspiracy are certainly mistaken, but they're not mistaken because they suffer from conspiratorial ideation or conspiracism. They're not mistaken because they believe a conspiratorial explanation of this event. They're absolutely correct to believe a conspiratorial explanation of this event. They're mistaken because they've misidentified the conspirators. And you'll notice on these definitions, even though these people use 9/11 as people's belief that American government agents were behind 9/11 as an example of conspiracism at work, it doesn't even fit their definitions. So look, if you look at Brotherton, French and Pickering's definition, for instance, conspiracist belief is the unnecessary assumption of a conspiracy where other explanations are more probable. That's not a case where assumption of conspiracy is unnecessary. It's absolutely necessary, whatever you believe about it. Okay, so the problem with the psychological, you might think, okay, they've chosen some bad examples. They should exercise greater care there, but I think the problem goes much deeper than that. The problem with psychological literature on this subject goes deeper than mere reliance on some poorly chosen examples. If psychologists genuinely want to find out if there's a problem with conspiracist ideation, or i.e. excessive willingness to believe conspiracy theories, they need to first have an idea of how willing one should be to believe conspiracy theories, and that would require them to have an idea of how widespread actual conspiracies are. And unfortunately, this is just not a question which psychologists are particularly well qualified to answer. If anyone has expertise relevant to this issue, they would presumably be historians or political scientists. In fact, I don't think there is such a thing as expertise on this subject, but I'd be glad to take that up in discussion with Stuart. In fact, as we've seen, psychologists, so far from being experts in this topic, namely how widespread conspiracies are, they tend to be remarkably naive about it, and this naivety is dangerous. There are well-documented cases of psychologists being used by the state to persecute people for believing in real conspiracies. The Martha Mitchell effect is a name given to the process by which a psychiatrist or psychologist labels a patient's accurate beliefs as delusional and misdiagnoses accordingly. Martha Mitchell, after whom the phenomenon is named, was the wife of Richard Nixon's Attorney General, John Mitchell. When she accused her husband and other White House officials of engaging in illegal conspiracies, the White House responded with a coordinated campaign to portray her claims as the product of mental illness and enlisted psychologists into that campaign. Ultimately, of course, she was vindicated, and a former husband was convicted, by then former husband, was convicted of several crimes, including conspiracy. So it's a lengthy conclusion here, move on with. I've considered a variety of unsatisfactory approaches to defining conspiracy theory. For the most part, however, the psychology literature on this subject, like the literature outside psychology, doesn't bother with definitions at all. In what appears to be the first published work on the psychology of conspiracy theories, published in Political Psychology, Ted Goertzel, G-O-E-R-T-Z-E-L, Goertzel, I take it, found that, quote, people who believe in one conspiracy theory were more likely to believe in others, end quote. Notice that this so-called finding, which is cited in almost all the psychology literature that I've looked at, and is described as, quote, particularly robust in French and Pickering 2013, presupposes wrongly that some people do not believe in any conspiracy theories at all. In particular, of course, it presupposes that neither he nor his readers believe any conspiracy theories. Instead of telling us what he means by the term conspiracy theory, his approach is to survey a number of people's attitudes to 10 things which he calls conspiracy theories, which, beyond positing a conspiracy, appear to have nothing in common except A, they are believed to be true by a large number of people, especially young, Black and Hispanic people, and B, not believed to be true by Goertzel himself or his presumed audience. Goertzel claims that his study demonstrates that minorities and young people are particularly prone to believing conspiracy theories, a finding which is often cited in the psychology literature. In fact, Goertzel seems to have simply chosen examples of purported conspiracies which minorities and young people are particularly likely to believe. And in at least one of his examples, the one I've already mentioned about the CIA being involved in drug running to inner city American communities, they're particularly likely to believe them because they're particularly likely to be aware that they are in fact true. Two of his other examples, that there were conspiracies behind the assassination of Martin Luther King and that Ronald Reagan conspired with the Iranian theocracy to ensure that American hostages would not be released until after the 1980 elections, are still highly controversial. The latter one I'm fairly confident is true, actually, but come to that later on. It seems likely that no one who hasn't spent a significant portion of their life researching these topics is particularly worth listening to on them. However, Goertzel cites no evidence on these topics whatsoever, or of any of his 10 conspiracy theories. He cites no evidence whatsoever that any of his 10 conspiracy theories are false. It's simply assumed that although many people, especially young people and members of minority communities, believe them, his readers will share his assumption that they're all so obviously false that no evidence or arguments to that effect are necessary. Some of them, I hasten to add, are obviously false, But they are not obviously false because they are conspiracy theories. They are obviously false because of the outlandish nature of the specific conspiracies they posit. There are, of course, plenty of beliefs that are, in some sense, conspiracy theories, which are both untrue and irrational. However, it does not follow, and it is not true, that they are untrue or irrational because they are conspiracy theories. The flaws with these theories have nothing to do with the fact that they postulate conspiracy. To dismiss them as conspiracy theories is to dismiss them for the wrong reason. And it leads to a wide variety of harms, not only to the individuals who are wrongly dismissed in this way, but also to society as a whole. What are these harms? Whenever we dismiss a belief as a conspiracy theory, or a person as in the grip of conspiracism or conspiracist ideation, we're implying, even if we don't mean to, that there is something wrong with believing, wanting to investigate, or giving any credence at all to the possibility that powerful people are engaged in secretive or covert behaviour. These terms, conspiracy theory, conspiracism, conspiracist ideation, are essentially tools to silence people and herd respectable opinion in ways that make it more likely that people will be able to get away with conspiracies. So one bad effect of these terms is that they contribute to a political culture in which it is easier for conspiracy to thrive at the expense of openness. And it's a sad irony, I think, that the term was popularised by the author of The Open Society. Another bad effect of these terms is that their use is an injustice to the people who are dismissed in this way. Following Miranda Fricker, we can call this a form of testimonial injustice. When someone asserts that a conspiracy has taken place, that person's word will usually be given less credence than it should because of an irrational prejudice produced by the negative connotations of these terms. When professional psychologists pathologize belief in conspiracy theories or conspiratorial ideation by treating them as phenomena standing in need of psychological explanation, this can be seen as a form of gaslighting, the manipulation of people into doubting their own sanity. I look forward to the day that we can look back on the pseudoscientific study of conspiracy theories by psychologists in the same way that we now look back on phrenology. I've argued against the current pejorative use of the term conspiracy theory. What is the alternative? Broadly speaking, there seem to be two options. First, we could retain the term without the pejorative connotations. This is the option Charles Pigden takes, arguing that a conspiracy theory should be understood simply as a theory according to which a conspiracy has taken place, and that conspiracy theories should be evaluated on their own merits like any other theory. While this would certainly be preferable to the current situation, I don't think stripping the term of its negative connotations is practically feasible. It was born as a pejorative term, and that's its nature. Furthermore, it's not clear to me that the term would serve any useful function after it was stripped of its negative connotations. Hence, I prefer another option, eliminativism. There simply is no such thing as a correct or even a good definition of these terms. We should stop using them altogether. They appear to do no good while doing considerable harm. And that's just a list of the various references that I used in that. And that's it. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, David, for that talk. And now is the stage of the event where we turn to our panel of respondents for some discussion questions.
I'm prepared to bite. First, an apology to David for coming in late. I got the time zone thing wrong. First an apology. Secondly, I quite like your idea that the term is essentially pejorative. That's basically what I'm going to be arguing tomorrow, that it is a tonkish term in the sense defined by Arthur Pryor when he invented the term tonk to argue against inferentialism in the philosophy of logic. The idea is you can't say that a logical term's meaning is entirely determined by the introduction and elimination rules with no constraint on what these can be, because if you do that, you can introduce a term which allows you to argue from truths to falsehoods. This was taken up by Michael Dummett in his Frege, The Philosophy of Language, as an analysis of pejoratives. And I'm now inclined to the view that what's wrong with conspiracy theory as it is widely used is that it is a tonkish term, that it is got an introduction rule. This theory is posits a conspiracy, and it's got an elimination rule. This theory is irrational. In fact, I think there are variations on this, which I'll go into another time. So the tendency of it is to allow you to infer truth from falsehood, and that's what it's for. That's what it's for. It's like pejoratives. What pejoratives do is license you to go from truths to falsehoods because you have an interest in doing so. Now, if you've got a term in the language which is essentially pejorative, you've got the option of reform, you've got the option of elimination, but the situation that a social scientist is faced with is that the term doesn't have a determinate extension. So you can't analyze, for example, the characteristics of people who believe in conspiracy theories because the term doesn't have a fixed extension. It means one thing to one set of people and another thing to another set of people. So you can't do responsible social science on it for kind of the reasons you were talking about. But there's just not, that's partly also because there's another rule. The rule is if I or the epistemic authorities in which to whom I subscribe believe a theory, it's not a conspiracy theory, even if it does posit a conspiracy. Right? So that's another rule which I think is in common use. That means, you know, the actual extension of the term is just a total mess. So that would be my thought, giving a preview of what I'm going to be saying, but it's essentially taking your idea that's an essentially pejorative term and then giving an analysis of how pejorative terms tend to work. As to the problem of whether to be an eliminativist or a reformist, right? You give a non-pejorative definition of the term or a reformist or eliminate the term altogether. The problem is if these are sort of regarded as interventions into a politico-cultural debate, they both are fairly utopian, right? You often have philosophers saying things like, we should eliminate such and such a term. And you think, yeah, and how are you going to do that? Writing a few articles in a philosophy journal? Well, pushing it publicly might help, but, it's an uphill struggle. That would be my comment on, the tail end of what sounded like an excellent paper.
Thank you, Charles. Just a few things in response to that. First, I want to respond with my own apology. I don't think I'm going to be able to make your paper tomorrow. I've got a tutorial I have to give, but I will watch it on YouTube. I like the idea of it being a tonkish term, and I think that's that's a fascinating idea. I don't know where to push it. I'm not sure. I mean, I think reform is much more utopian than eliminativism. Reform seems, I don't think the term really ever had any non-derogatory meaning. So it's not like we can go back to some antecedent meaning that it had. And it's just not clear to me that once the derogatory connotations were gone from it, that it really would serve any useful function whatsoever. Eliminativism seems utopian certainly in the short term, but in the longer term, not so much, because after all, we did once get by without these terms. And we seem to be able to say everything we needed to be able to say. And I don't see why we can't, in the long term, aim at least towards that goal. But yes, you're right, we're just little academics. We're not major movers and shakers of thought, so we can but do our best. Yeah, so I don't think I have anything further to say in response to that.
Actually, so if I can push back on that, on the history of the term. So it's true that the explicit term conspiracy theory, as we say in English, is actually relatively recent. So it probably goes back to just before the beginning of the 20th century, if the dictionary stuff is to be believed. But we find iterations of the same kind of terminology in French around the French Revolution. The Romans talked about conspiracy narratives at the end of the Roman Republic in the same way that we talk about conspiracy theories now. So I don't think it's the case that the term is new and we got by without it for a really long time. We can go back to getting by without it. The term has been invariant in use for as long as we've got recorded history. People have been talking about conspiracies and people talking about how silly people are to talk about conspiracies. So I kind of worry about the elimination route, because I don't think we can go back to the utopia of when we didn't talk about conspiracy theories, because history seems to show actually we've been talking about them for a long time nonetheless. And actually, I wonder whether actually eliminativism is actually dystopic rather than utopic in the way that Charles was talking about. Because let's say that we academics decide to give up talking about things like conspiracy theory. What's going to stop politicians who want to get by on rhetorical point scoring from going, luckily, the people who go around actually fisking what we say and telling people, actually, no, that's not an unwarranted conspiracy theory, that's a warranted one, they've given up on using these terms now. So I can get by in my political discourse, which is usually completely unrelated to academic usage, by talking about conspiracy theories all the time. And it has rhetorical force when I talk to the general populace about these things. So I think the reformist position, or as the way I do it, just the stipulative position, you might mean this thing by conspiracy theory, but actually from an academic perspective, let's define it as this particular thing here and then analyze it, is actually the better route to take.
Okay, thanks, Matthew. On the first point, yeah, look, you may be right. I mean, I don't know. I'm sure you are right about the later Roman Republic, but certainly I think before the 50s and certainly before the Kennedy assassination, there just wasn't the sort of widespread popular use of this term, or any term that served, as far as I can tell, a functional equivalent. And if the late Roman, was it the late Roman Republic?
Yeah,
the Roman Empire, late Roman Republic, was using a similar term, similar Latin version, presumably, of that term, then I imagine it was serving a similar function to what it now serves, namely to dismiss people who rightly or wrongly thought there were conspiracies going on. And as we all know, there were an awful lot of conspiracies going on. The Catalan conspiracy immediately jumps ahead. There were various conspiracies to assassinate Caesar and so on. So it may well be that historically this term pops up whenever there are a lot of conspiracies that people want people not to talk about or believe, and it serves the rhetoric of stopping them from doing that. But it doesn't seem to me that getting rid of the term is impossible, or at least drastically reducing its usage, as it seems to me was roughly the situation before the 1950s. Now, as to whether it's dystopian or utopian to think that, I mean, I'm against using the term conspiracy theory, but I'm not against mentioning it. And there's no reason academics can't, step up and whenever a politician dismisses conspiracy theories, then say, well, look, what do they mean by this, and so on, and run that spiel. I don't think eliminativism doesn't mean, it doesn't mean getting rid of the term or not mentioning the term. It just means not using the term. So I think that, yeah, there is a response there.
Can I chip in on this? Because I had similar thoughts, David. I mean, what you're trying to eliminate is quite narrow, because it's not like you want people to stop being able to make accusations that conspiracies are occurring. Okay. So you're in favor of people being able to voice their concerns when they fear that a conspiracy is taking place.
Sure.
And I take it you would have no objection to them presenting their accusations or fears of a conspiracy taking place in the form of a theory. So you're not against conspiracies and you're not against theories. Yeah. What you seem to be against is conspiracy theories, where the term conspiracy theories is used by people at this kind of meta level to dismiss the theories about conspiracies, as it were. So
yeah, look, I'm certainly not against people talking about theories, though. Of course, one has to be terribly careful in how one uses the term theory, because it's highly ambiguous. Yeah. Conspiracy itself is somewhat ambiguous, but not nearly so much. And I'm certainly not against using either of those terms. It's very much the conjunction of them. And look, it is worth noting, I think, in this context, that sometimes that negative connotation will be, the word theory can drop off. So I was watching, very rarely do this these days, but I was watching some cable news the other day, and I have to admit this was on Fox, because of how balanced I am. And
there are a lot of surprises in this talk.
And they had some sort of token liberal on there, and this token liberal was saying, this was just before Trump was no longer president, back in early January, and he was saying that Trump was, planning to overthrow the democracy and so on. And the host said, "We won't have any of that conspiracy stuff on here." So he didn't actually say conspiracy theory, but it was filled with all the negative connotations that are associated with it. It's conspiracy stuff. And certainly I'd be against that kind of use of it. So for the same reason. But of course, when people in the not too distant past, it was a perfectly usable term, like the term plot and so on, which was used to describe things that really happened and that everyone did some of the time, and some people did almost all the time.
So the worry here is that one problem is that this eliminating, as has been pointed out, seems a bit idealistic. The thought that a few philosophers could persuade people to change the language seems idealistic. But another problem is that when you try and describe it, it's actually kind of, very kind of careful, like keyhole surgery that you want to conduct. The simplest way of eliminating conspiracy theory was to eliminate talk of conspiracies and eliminate talk of theories, but you don't want to do that. No, you want to do something much more subtle. And I just cannot see it working.
Yeah, I'm not.
So I'm with Charles.
I'm not convinced it's that subtle, and I do think it's worth pointing out. Look at what we say, we're mere philosophers, but Karl Popper himself was a mere philosopher, and he changed the way we talk and thought. He's changed the way, and in very bad ways, in my opinion, and particularly by popularizing this term and related terms, and also, of course, falsification, which has also had, I think, a very bad influence on the way people think of philosophy of science. But yes, philosophers sometimes do manage to change the way people talk and think way beyond the academy.
So I think I'll jump in here. So first of all, as a student of Pat and Paul Churchland, I'm down with eliminativism as an approach. So I don't have issues with that. Although, I mean, it's kind of interesting the way that you're using the term is importantly different than the way that Feyerabend and Sellers talked about, or at least the way this conversation is going. I don't know if it's really what you want to do, because the distinction was always made between when changing the language within scientific discourse as versus changing the common everyday language. A limited materialist of the sort that talked about eliminativism with respect to, concepts in philosophy of mind and folk psychology, the idea was never to change the way everyday people are going to talk. Everyday people are going to talk about memory as a unified function. They're going to talk about awareness. They're going to talk about, all the things that people talk about, just the same as, we talk about the weight of objects affecting how fast they fall. It's like, okay, the way the folk talk about it, that's neither here nor there as far as the limitativists are concerned. What they're concerned about is how should the scientists talk about it? Should they adopt that language willy-nilly from the folk and then keep using it? And it seems to me there's a way in which you could take your argument, the way that you set it up at least, is, look, you're not necessarily saying that maybe journalists, should necessarily talk about these things differently, or everyday people, but these psychologists that you're talking about is like, the limitativist target is them and their use of the language. Like, they don't talk about demons anymore in psychology, even though people who did psychological theory in the medieval period did talk about demons as an explanation for psychological things. We just nope, we've eliminated that talk from our scientific psychology. And it seems like one way of reading what you're doing, David, is saying, yeah, we need to eliminate this term conspiracy theory from the kind of social psychology literature that you trotted out. Nice examples of people using it in a way that maybe needs to be revised in one way or another.
Yeah.
I have a further question, but I'll let you respond to that first.
Respond to that. Yeah, look, I do. Yeah, I certainly want to see it eliminated from the psychology literature altogether. Absolutely, I think this is all, as I made clear what I think of it. I think, but I do want to go further than that. I do want to see journalists. I'd love to see journalists who, when they start talking about QAnon or things like that, they just stop saying the conspiracy theory QAnon and say what it is they think is wrong with QAnon. And if they're going to do it, it just gives this an entirely false impression that what's wrong with QAnon is that it posits a conspiracy, when there's lots of things you can say about why that particular conspiracy is totally batshit crazy. And that's what they should be saying, but they're hiding behind this term, which gives the QAnon people a perfectly legitimate response because they've identified the wrong thing, which is wrong with their position. So, but look, you are right in this extent. I mean, I think as Berkeley says, or Berkeley, as you Americans would say, says somewhere, we should speak with the vulgar and think with the learned. So what I'd at least say, there are certain contexts in which it is okay, you should eliminate all thought of conspiracy theory within your own mind, but when engaged with dialogue with other people who are using it, then you should follow Charles's advice and say it just means a theory that posits a conspiracy and it should be evaluated on its merits, and that's it. So that would be as far as I would go concession in that direction. So your second question, or second point.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing I was just going to ask you about is, so one of the big differences, I think, between the academic worlds of the kind of psychologists you've been talking about and those of us who are philosophers is that they're operating in a realm in which one of their concerns is psychopathology. That because we've talked a lot about the important heritage that we point to of Karl Popper, but they're going to point to Hofstadter as being an important predecessor, and there the concept is this pathologizing concept of paranoia, right? This idea that there are individuals who are we would talk about paranoid schizophrenia, or we would talk about having different kinds of psychotic breaks with reality, the kind of things that psychologists are happy to talk about, that usually in the philosophical discussions, I know I did, and lots of other people here, when you talk about it, like, oh, we're bracketing off talking about the psychological pathology of things. Maybe sometimes we say, like, that's why we have this term conspiracism. Conspiracism is more pointing in the direction of people who've got maybe psychiatric difficulties, and should be looked at from a psychiatric point of view. We're kind of bracketing that, and we're going to be looking at people who don't fall under that thing, but just have unpopular beliefs of one sort or another, or beliefs that others think needs more justification than they're given. And I'm curious, given your pushback against the use of conspiracy theory as a term, what do you make of the distinction of talking about people who are paranoid? I mean, in a clinical sense.
Right.
I mean, Hofstadter himself was careful. He recognized that maybe he was pathologizing something he shouldn't be pathologizing. But I think particularly when we get back to some of the issues with the current case of conspiracy theorizing in the country, that some people are worrying about, that there might be a reason to start talking about maybe pathology in certain cases, or at least that should be on the table as something when you're looking at individual people that are found in Washington, D.C. on January 6th, that some of those people might better be described in psychiatric terms than in the kind of epistemic, pragmatic terms that we're talking about today.
Thanks, Charles. That's a really good question. Now, I don't have any fundamental problem with the term paranoia, though it should always, as Hofstadter himself recognized, be used with great care, especially in political contexts, because the long record and ongoing practice of pathologizing the views of people who disagree with one. And I think one of the unfortunate, if you see the psychological literature on conspiracy theories as continuous with the psychological literature on paranoia, it's a move in a very bad direction, I think. You can see that from the kind of examples they're using. They're not talking about cases where people believe that someone is out to get them. They are talking about situations in which people are out, one group of people is out to get another group of people, which they may or may not be a part of. So if you take, for example, the journalist Gary Webb, who was widely derided at the time as a conspiracy theorist, and is regularly cited as an example of this, and his work on this as a conspiracy theory in the psychological literature in the 90s, and even still, despite him having been vindicated since then. He wasn't in any sense paranoid. He was talking about what was being done to Black communities in Los Angeles and other major urban centers, and he wasn't Black or living in an urban center. So it wasn't about they were out to get him. That wasn't the nature of it. It wasn't in any sense paranoid. So, and the other shift, which is connected with this, is you see all the examples become political examples. They're all about the public world. They're not about individuals. They're not about, their friends or neighbors out to get them. They're about, various factions of who they perceive, rightly or wrongly, as belonging to the ruling class, as being out to get them. So, I guess the two parts of that, look, there are concerns about the term paranoia, but I don't think there's any doubt that it picks out a real and fairly widespread phenomenon. But it's quite a different phenomenon, it seems to me, that the one that is conspiracy theory is being targeted at. And I think the real concerns about paranoia come when you start characterizing your political opponents that way. That's something that is dangerous and should be avoided. That's my general view about that. But, it doesn't mean it's impossible. And it may be that many of the people, and I think it is the case that many of the people on January the 6th were paranoid. they certainly seem to be nuts in some way or other from what I saw. Whether, yeah, I'm no psychoanalyst, but many of them were obviously batshit crazy.
Great, thanks, David.
Can I ask a question? This is a bit of a follow-up to Brian's question. I mean, I was also wondering about the difficulty of getting talk about conspiracy theories even out of psychology. So, I mean, one thing psychologists do a lot is study cognitive biases. And so some of the cognitive biases they study seem to have implications for people's propensity to believe in conspiracies. So, for example, it is alleged that there is a hypersensitive agency detection device that has evolved in people's brains. Now, I'm a bit skeptical about this myself, but I could see that if someone does believe it, they believe people are systematically inclined to over-attribute agency when there is none. And it seems like a straightforward consequence of this is, well, people are going to over-attribute conspiracies. So I guess I'm not seeing how practically, I mean, it seems like if we're to tell psychologists, stop thinking about hypersensitive agency detection, they're just going to tell us to go away and let them do their job. And it also seems that if one of the consequences of being allowed to talk about hypersensitive agency detection is that you're going to go on to explain, and this thing in your brain disposes you to over-attribute conspiracies to the world, then it looks like they're just studying conspiracy theorizing. So I'm just not seeing how practically you're going to get the study of conspiracy theorizing out of psychology.
Okay. On the alleged hypersensitive agency detective device, I share your skepticism. In fact, I think I'd be a great deal more, I suspect I'm a great deal more skeptical of that myself. Now, it seems to me that literature really comes out of a very condescending anthropology, which I hope we've got beyond, where, primitive peoples always, find someone to blame for anything that goes wrong. Whereas we much more sophisticated people in the sort of post-Scottish Enlightenment realise that things that happen happen not because of the intentional desire for anyone to bring them about. Now, it seems to me that even if it's true that there is some genetic disposition to over-attribute agency, and I think that is at best extremely speculative, that disposition has far more than been counterweighed in our culture by a tendency to underestimate the extent to which activities are the result of intentional agency. Let me just give you a few examples of this. Haven't got them to hand, but there's an amazing amount of literature that came out in the wake of the global financial crisis, which quite explicitly took this to be like a natural event. This wasn't a natural event. This was the result of intentional agency on the part of a whole lot of people, many of whom foresaw what was happening and managed to make enormous profits on it and benefited from it. None of those people were held to account because I think there is a general propaganda out there that we can't attribute responsibility to these things, that financial crashes and other social ills, even wars, are just, as it were, shit that happens, not shit that happens because certain people plot that they come about. One of the favorite examples of this was every newspaper that I'm aware of, every headline that I saw the day America, Australia and Britain attacked Iraq in 2003, headlined with "Bombs Fall on Iraq," as if this was not the result of intentional agents attacking Iraq, but some natural phenomena happening, God knows why, that no one could help. So look, I think even if it's true that there's this biological predisposition, a lot of what we do is not determined by our biology. An awful lot of it's determined by our sociality and by the propaganda we're surrounded by. And I think one of the key items of that propaganda is to downplay the extent to which agents intentionally bring about bad things.
I mean, I agree with all of that, David, but I'm still not seeing that that leads to the conclusion that psychologists stop talking about conspiracy theories. What I think they should be doing what they should be doing is try and figure out how much these countervailing tendencies impact upon one another and where and when they do so. So, you know, if there was something like a hypersensitive agency detection device, then let's find out when it impacts upon us. And if there are cultural forces that move the other way and are incline us to not see conspiracy theories, then let's try and figure out when those kick in. So I think I'm in favor of talking about conspiracy theories because I want to understand how these things interact.
Yeah, but look, if they are to do this, they've got to have some kind of idea of how widespread conspiracies are in the first place. Otherwise, we're just bringing our own dispositions to this. And psychologists, as I tried to argue in the paper, are not only not experts on this by any means, they are amazingly naive about this. I mean,
any kind of investigation in the world is going to start out from a place of ignorance. And I don't think you can sort of say, oh, we can't do physics until we've figured out all the facts about the physical world before we pursue it. And I would have thought the same with psychology.
This is a domain. This is not a domain in which psychologists, it's not a domain which psychology could possibly give us any insight into. Therefore, they can't be experts into it. It's something one learns from history, from studying politics.
Right. Well, I mean, I'm in favour of them taking account of the evidence that historians and political scientists throw up, and working with that.
Yes, so we should be getting historians and political people with expertise, particularly in political history, engaged in that, not psychologists.
Well, the psychologists should build upon what they've done, what the politicians, political scientists and historians have done. That's my view.
Chief, if I can have a finger on this, so I have a lot of correspondence with Karen Douglas at Kent, who does work on the social psychology of conspiracy theory, and I know that post the conference that Joe Usinski organized in Miami, which was all the way back in 2016, it seems like several eons ago, social psychologists have very recently actually started paying much more attention to the wider literature in the social sciences. And so you're finding some of those social psychologists are beginning to cite philosophers on this and refining their definitions and being aware they've got to do slightly more to define their key terms to work out exactly what the extent of this thing called belief in conspiracy theories is. So I think there is some hope that there is a reformation project going on in social psychology at the moment due to philosophers reaching out and saying, maybe you might want to think about these things.
Look, I'd be, obviously that would be good if they exhibited more awareness of, the fact that there really are conspiracies and lots of them, and that they're important to the development of history and so on and so forth. But just citing a few books on this, I mean, in order to have the relevant amount of expertise, I would think they'd have to be historians, and particularly historians of politics. And I think that's simply too much to ask. Yes, Charles.
Can I come in? So, arguing slightly against this, the thing I thought at first I would talk about was Christopher Andrews' book, The Secret World. And this is a history of espionage. Now, espionage is, of course, excuse me, I haven't got COVID. I've just got an asthma-induced cough. Nobody need worry on my behalf. Anyway, what he talks about is of course, the history of espionage, which, as I say, is essentially conspiratorial. But he talks about the fact that a number of key figures, his principal person that he talks about in this connection is Stalin, were too prone to conspiratorial thinking. And if you know about Stalin as a political agent, you'll think, yeah, it's kind of onto something here. But then you want to say, so what is wrong? I mean, it's not that he believed in conspiracies. He obviously believed in conspiracies, often perfectly rationally, because he himself was a major conspirator in all sorts of ways. You know, if he thought there was a conspiracy to rob the bank in, where was it, Yerevan or someplace, he should certainly have believed in that because he was a leader of that conspiracy. So, you know, what was wrong with him that made him overly prone to believe in conspiracy theories? Overly due to see conspiracies where they weren't there, even though, of course, he often saw them when they really were there. Isn't this a topic of inquiry? Because it might not just be him, right? It might not just be Stalin. Is there a tendency that some people have to see too much agency, too much deliberation in affairs, to systematically discount invisible hand explanations in favor of hidden hand explanations? Just as it can, of course, be the other way around, some people can be saying, oh, nobody ever conspires, so you systematically discount hidden hand explanations in favor of invisible hand explanations. and it seems to me that there is a psychological phenomenon to be investigated here. The problem is delimiting that, because you need to have a reasonably good idea when it is and is not sensible to believe in a conspiracy theory before you can conduct sensible psychological research on the kinds of irrationality that might prompt people to be overly prone to believe in conspiracy theories when they're not there. So I think there's that problem. And, you know, I do think that there is something real here. There is something real, namely a tendency on the part of some people to be overly prone to believe in conspiracy. As there is also the reverse tendency, which I think is not to be pathologized, except in the sense you might pathologize a corrupt culture. It's not due to like individual failings of rationality. It's due to you swallowing a certain kind of cultural Kool-Aid. So eliminating the terms altogether eliminates an area of legitimate inquiry for social psychologists. The problem is they just do it incredibly badly. And if they're going to do it at all, they ought to do it in a much more historically informed way. So, you know, no obvious propedeutic, nobody doing social psychology of conspiracy in the United States of America should consider putting pen to paper or formulating a grant proposal unless they'd first read Catherine Z. Olmsted's Real Enemies, which of course is interesting because it illustrates the way that false conspiracy theories and real conspiracies interact in the generation of historical events.
Charles, can I just come back on that after a brief toilet break? I will be back in 2 minutes.
And I'll say something, if I may, without that. I've been looking for the quote. Keynes says somewhere, this is related to the impotence of philosophers, ideas are really influential. look around the world and you'll see everybody who proclaims himself a devotee of plain common sense is in fact the slave to some defunct thinker, often an economist of yesteryear. You know, Keynes goes on about this at great length. I just have not been able, I've been looking at the essential Keynes and have not been able to find the quote. I know it's in there because I can't quite remember what it is. So maybe we should, you know, I'm now going against what I said earlier. Maybe, of course, one should be very careful of having utopian ambitions for the reform of usage, but it's not utterly impossible that you can do this if you really stick at it over the long term. Anyway, that's a message of hope to counter my message of pessimism.
Hi, sorry, Charles, I missed the last bit of what you said, but
the last bit I was just taking. There's a quote which you probably know somewhere in Keynes, and I just haven't been able to track it down, where he says something like, "Ideas can influence events. People who proclaim themselves untheoretical adherents of common sense are often the slaves to some defunct theorist of yesteryear." And ideas do make a difference, and they can have an influence on policy, though it tends to take a long time. So I was reversing, or at least qualifying, my formerly pessimistic remarks about the difficulty of influencing the public discourse. It can, but you can do it, but it's a long-term struggle. But I really wanted to address the Stalin issue, if you like. Isn't there something wrong with these people? And isn't this a legitimate topic for psychological inquiry?
Well, there's certainly a great deal wrong with Stalin. I won't go into all those things, but on the specific issue, now look, what I would say is, to return to the issue of paranoia, one thing that was wrong with him was that he was paranoid. So I don't think we need to invoke any concept of conspiracy theory, just the old concept of paranoia. And you could argue that he was paranoid because he had an exceptionally hypersensitive agency detector. And, you know, I think you don't need the language of conspiracy theory to say what you want to say in that context. What the language of conspiracy theory brings, and what is wrong with it, is that it is applied principally to people who are on the margins politically. And no one by any stretch of the imagination could describe Stalin as being a marginal player politically. It's a way of dismissing people who are outside of a given orthodoxy, certainly not of dismissing people who create what is orthodox for their time and place. So yes, I think Stalin was paranoid. It's worth noting, I think, that Popper, though he talks a lot about how widespread the conspiracy theory of society is in amongst the social sciences, he says it's, you know, presupposed. He never gives any examples of that, which is fairly striking, because I think he's just wrong about that. And the only example he gives of someone who he calls a conspiracy theorist is Hitler, of all things. And again, I mean, Hitler was, I think, like Stalin, a paranoid person, and saw plots, not plots in general, but plots against him all over the place. And many of them, of course, were real. Many of them were imaginary, and so on. And it may well be, I think, that in the kinds of worlds in which those people came to power, having a hypersensitive agency detection device, or as it were, being paranoid, could be something that selects in one's favour. And yes, those are perfectly legitimate issues to investigate, but I don't think you need the language or the rhetoric of conspiracy theory. I don't think it helps at all.
Right. I mean, the comeback, if there would be, and again, I'd have to like read Christopher Andrews cover to cover, because he just he certainly says this about Stalin. Stalin, for example, couldn't accept information if it was like honesty come by. Someone would tell him something, they had no motive to lie, he would assume they were lying. So information had to be fed to him in a way which made it look like it had been acquired dishonestly, right? So Churchill wanted to convince Stalin of something. He had to trick him into believing that Stalin had acquired this information dishonestly before he would believe it, So which was, like a major problem. Lots of people die because of this. Not the ones Stalin killed, but the ones he actually didn't want to die. I think that Andrews wants to say that this is a besetting sin of people who operate in the secret world. So you are involved in essentially conspiratorial activity. That's your bread and butter. And you then develop a tendency to believe in more conspiracies than are warranted, and to, become, absurdly suspicious about everybody. Maybe, this isn't a topic for psychology. It's a topic, except in the sense that we're trying to pathologize we're trying to look at the psychology of a very specific group of people deeply involved in the secret world.
Right. Look, that seems more plausible than, an awful lot of the literature on conspiracy theories, of course, both in the psychology, some of which I cited, but also in the social science literature and beyond, tends to say that it's particularly prominent, belief in conspiracy, amongst impoverished or marginalized groups. Now, if that was the case, I think there's no evidence at all that is the case, but just assuming for the moment that it were the case, then that might have a similar kind of explanation, in the sense that you are actually witness to more conspiracies because you're more likely to be the target of conspiracies in that situation. I guess it's a possibility if there's a general presupposition that you're more likely to believe in a phenomena if you've actually witnessed the phenomenon yourself, rather than finding out about it at secondhand in various ways. And that, I think that probably is a genuine, widespread human disposition, and probably, yes, not a generally rational one. But yes, I'm being fairly speculative at that end. It may.
Yeah, so am I. But I guess what I'm saying is,
yeah,
there's a phenomenon to be investigated here.
Yeah,
that some people are overly prone to conspiratorial thinking. And there are two ways this could happen. There's the one where they see a conspiracy where there isn't one, and where they see an incredibly complex conspiracy where there's a much simpler one.
Yeah.
We haven't talked about that because many of the definitions are just too naive to notice that distinction. But that's a way someone could be prone to be too conspiratorial. And I think that's the thing, that one of the things that Andrews is accusing Stalin of.
Yeah.
Of course there were conspiracies, but he picks the most elaborate one rather than the sort of more simple, straightforward one where. It may be that this is too context bound, too historically specific, too tied to the biographies of particular people for there to be a useful psychological theory.
Yeah. Oh, I think that's very likely the case. One, this is anecdotal, of course, but on the topic of spying, a little while back, I read the official history of MI5. Well, I didn't read it from cover to cover, but I went through it looking for references to conspiracy theories, and it's full of them. And it's always, used in that derisory way. And, certainly if you take the official history of the MI5 at face value, it's very unclear what they actually did. The very idea that they actually did spying any kind is just a crazy conspiracy theory, and in particular the view that that they spied on Harold Wilson, which is as well documented as virtually any historical fact, is explicitly denied and derided as a crazy conspiracy theory. So that's presumably written by spies who you might think, if your reasoning is correct, are over prone to believing in conspiracy theories. And of course, they could just be lying. But I sense that there's also going to be a tendency to deceive yourself that what you're engaged in is not conspiring. And if people believe that you are doing what you're in fact doing, they're just crazy.
Yeah, there's the interesting example, which is again in Olmsted's book, of J. Edgar Hoover didn't tell Truman about the Venona decrypts. So the Venona decrypts are actually exposing, SIGINT, it's actually exposing an attempt to, and a fairly successful attempt to penetrate the New Deal administration by the Soviet apparatus. And it's kept secret from the president. The president isn't allowed to know. Why? Well, it's the sort of conspiratorial paranoia of J. Edgar Hoover. But, Truman thought that Hoover was too prone to believe in conspiracy theories. And so whenever Hoover came up with a conspiracy theory, Truman took it with a very large pinch of salt. And after a while, it seems that Hoover just stopped telling Truman things, even when he actually had evidence of a genuine conspiracy. It's a very strange set of
not in an attempt to not an attempt to damage Truman or the Democrats, but
it could have been that if he was like holding it in reserve. But which he was capable of doing, that kind of thing. Release it at a certain point.
Right.
So it's not clear why he did it. I think he didn't. He may have, he was overly prone to believe in conspiracies. That's kind of an occupational hazard of somebody who is the head of the FBI. And so maybe he just thought that Truman was not reliable. I don't know if he knew that Harry Dexter White was definitely passing information to the Soviets, which is, that was what was he, Treasury Secretary or something like that. As I say, the odd mixture of false or irrational conspiracy theories and genuine conspiracies in generating the sequence of quite large-scale historical events is just really interesting. That's why it's such a great book.
I'm wondering if it's time. There's one two-part question from an attendee that I think for David that I think might be actually a useful way to invite you to recapitulate or summarize the main argument again of the paper as we head towards a conclusion here. And so the question from a former student of ours is really whether this is just a matter of semantics, I guess using the word semantics in a pejorative term. When we talk about people storming the Capitol, for example, because they thought there was widespread voter fraud, isn't it just a semantic issue whether we call them conspiracy theorists or something else? And if you want to replace that pejorative conspiracy theory usage with something else, then what should we use? When we hear people saying vaccines contain microchips, et cetera, should we call it fake news, or what would be the language you'd want to replace that term with?
Okay, look, I don't think people should ever say just semantics. Semantics matters enormously, and yes, it is semantics, but it's what matters more than the words we use and what they mean. Look, I don't claim to know enough about what was going on in the heads of people who raided the Capitol building on January the 6th to have a robust account of their motives and so on. I do, but I'm absolutely confident that nothing is gained by characterizing them as conspiracy theorists or using that as an explanation or putative explanation for why they behaved the way they did. I have no particular expertise in their motives. I am a long-time student of and interested in American politics. I have a story about the Trump phenomenon. I think it would be a little bit of a distraction to go into exactly what is behind that right now. But I don't think there's anything that should stop you saying perfectly sensible things about the people, or rational things, or things that are up for debate about the motivations of those people. And you don't need to use this, made up pejorative neologism to do it. I think the old term disenfranchised springs immediately to mind. I think there are people who are disenfranchised. I think there are people who are manipulated. I think there are obviously, to a very large extent, people with very low levels of education. And that goes a long way towards explaining why they were manipulated into doing the things they did. So I guess that's, I'm not talking about replacing it with some other term. I'm just saying let's get along without it as we used to beforehand, when we were capable of discussing these things without it.
Okay, thank you, David, and thank you to David Coady and to all the panelists for a really fantastic discussion, and for the attendees for joining us tonight. I do want to save some energy for our next session tomorrow night at the same time, so hopefully everyone who's here will be able to make it for Charles Pigden's talk tomorrow night, the finale of our year-long discussion of the philosophy of conspiracy theory. And so thanks again for a fantastic session. It was very illuminating, and I look forward to seeing everyone tomorrow night then.
Thank you, everyone. And thanks for organizing it.
Sure, no problem. Yep.
Thank you, David.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
See everybody tomorrow night, or tomorrow, whatever day or night.
Midday. Tomorrow midday.
Tomorrow midday. There you go.